April 12th, 1992. The old camera was nothing special, or so she thought. Clara had found it while cleaning out her grandmother's attic on an April afternoon, buried under piles of old letters and crumbling photo albums. It was a Polaroid, the kind her grandmother must have used back in the day, with its cracked leather casing and worn strap that hinted at years of use. Clara almost left it there among the other forgotten items, but something about it drew her in. Holding the camera felt strangely comforting, almost like holding a piece of the past. She dusted it off and took it downstairs, telling herself it was a nice piece to keep as a memento. Polaroids were practically antiques now, and she figured it would look good on her bookshelf. That night, after setting it up on a shelf in her apartment, she noticed a strange detail. The camera seemed to have film inside it. She laughed at herself, thinking there's no way the film would still work after all these years. But the temptation to try it was too strong. She turned the camera on herself, raising it to her eye, and pressed the shutter. It clicked with a surprisingly loud snap, and the Polaroid worked as a photograph slid out. She watched, slightly amazed, as the image slowly developed. In seconds, her face appeared, framed perfectly, her eyes reflecting the light in the room with an almost glassy quality. She couldn't explain it, but the photo made her uneasy. There was something off. Her expression looked too blank, her eyes too intense. She chalked it up to her own imagination and slid the photo into her pocket, figuring she'd take more pictures later and compare them. The next day, Clara brought the camera with her as she ran errands around town. She couldn't resist snapping a few photos here and there, her favorite coffee shop, a couple walking their dog, the storefront of a thrift shop she liked. She wasn't exactly sure what she'd do with the photos, but there was something satisfying about capturing these little moments on film, as if she were preserving them forever. But when she got home and began to look at the photos, she noticed something that made her pause. In each photo, there was a faint figure in the background. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a passerby. But as she looked closer, she realized it was the same figure in every photo, a person standing in the distance, barely visible, almost as if they were watching her. She laughed nervously, convincing herself it was just a coincidence, a strange quirk of the camera's old lens. She even told herself that it was possible she hadn't noticed the person while taking the pictures. But deep down, a sense of unease crept into her mind, lingering at the edges of her thoughts. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She kept glancing at the photos on her bedside table, her eyes drawn to the faint, blurry figure lurking in the background. The following day, Clara took more photos, determined to prove to herself that it was just her imagination. She snapped pictures of familiar places, the park near her apartment, her favorite bookstore, even her own building from across the street. She tried to focus on capturing the beauty of each scene, hoping the act of taking photos would ease her anxiety. But when she looked at the new photos, the figure was still there. This time, it was closer. In each image, the figure had moved, just a little, drawing nearer to the foreground, its shape slightly clearer. She could make out more details now, a tall, thin frame, a shadowy outline, the suggestion of a face that seemed to peer through the lens, directly at her. Clara's hands shook as she flipped through the photos, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't explain. She wanted to believe it was all just a strange coincidence, a trick of the light, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The camera felt cold in her hands, almost as if it were holding some kind of energy, a presence that seeped into her skin. Determined to get to the bottom of it, she searched the camera for any clues, any sign that might explain what was happening. She found nothing, no hidden messages, no strange settings, just the same old Polaroid her grandmother must have used decades ago. Frustrated, she decided to test the camera one last time. She lifted it, aimed it at herself, and pressed the shutter. The flash lit up the room, casting sharp shadows on the walls. The photo slid out, and she waited, her breath held as the image developed. Her own face appeared, but it was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, her mouth slightly open, her expression frozen in a look of horror that she hadn't felt when she took the picture. And there, just over her shoulder, was the figure. Closer now, close enough that she could almost make out its face. She dropped the photo, her hands trembling, and backed away from the camera. The room felt colder, darker, as if the shadows had deepened, closing in around her. She grabbed the photos and shoved them into a drawer, telling herself she would deal with it later, that it was just her imagination, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But that night, as she lay in bed, the fear gnawed at her. She couldn't stop thinking about the figure, its shadowy form lurking in the background of every photo, creeping closer and closer. She kept glancing at her bedroom door, half expecting to see it standing there, watching her with those dark, empty eyes. In the days that followed, Clara avoided the camera, trying to forget about the photos and the figure that haunted her thoughts. But she could still feel its presence, a cold, heavy weight that pressed down on her, like a shadow she couldn't escape. Then, on April 17th, something happened that shattered any illusion of safety she had left. She was sitting in her living room, lost in thought, when she heard a faint clicking sound. She froze, her heart pounding as the sound repeated, soft but insistent, echoing through the silence of her apartment. It was coming from the drawer where she had stashed the camera and the photos. She approached slowly, her hands shaking as she opened the drawer. The camera was lying there, just as she had left it, but the photos were different. They were blank. Every photo she had taken, every image that had haunted her for days, was now nothing but a blank, white square. She flipped through them, her mind racing, trying to make sense of it. But there was no explanation, no logical reason for what had happened. And then, she saw it. One photo, at the very bottom of the stack, had an image. It was of her apartment, taken from the hallway, as if someone had been standing just outside her door, watching her. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the photo, her mind reeling with fear and confusion. She hadn't taken this picture. She would have remembered. And yet, there it was, a perfectly clear image of her apartment, the door slightly ajar, as if someone had been standing just outside, waiting. A sudden realization hit her, sending a chill down her spine. The figure hadn't been in the photos. It had been outside, watching her. With shaking hands, she lifted the camera, aiming it at the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She pressed the shutter, the flash lighting up the darkness for a brief moment. The photo slid out, developing slowly, and as the image took shape, her breath caught in her throat. There it was. The figure. Standing in the hallway, its face just a blur, a dark shadow that seemed to bleed into the walls. And this time, it was facing her. She stumbled back, her mind screaming at her to run, to get out of the apartment, to escape. But she couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the photo, from the dark, shadowy figure that seemed to be watching her through the lens. And then, she heard it. A faint, soft click coming from the camera. The sound of the shutter. Slowly, she lifted the camera, her hands trembling as she pulled out the latest photo. It was a picture of her, standing in the hallway, her face twisted in a look of terror. And over her shoulder, the figure was there, its face inches away, a dark, empty void that seemed to swallow the light, to consume everything in its path. She dropped the photo, her heart pounding as she stumbled back, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, as if they were closing in around her, suffocating her. And then, she heard the click again. The sound of the shutter, capturing her last moments.